The morning Frances Barrett walked into Caldwell, Kansas with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a reputation that had arrived 3 days before her, every head on Main Street turned, not in welcome, but in judgment, and she felt every single stare like the press of a hot iron against her skin. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell was the kind of cattle town that chewed through people the way longhorns chewed through open prairie grass, indifferently, methodically, without a single thought for what it left behind. The Santa Fe Railroad had come through the year prior, and the cattle drives from Texas had followed, filling the town with drovers and merchants and gamblers and all manner of men who believed that money and noise together constituted civilization. There were 2 churches, 4 saloons, a dry goods store, a livery, and a sheriff's office that smelled permanently of tobacco and old leather. And there was gossip, which was the true currency of every small western town, more valuable than cattle or gold, because it cost nothing to produce and never ran out. Frances was 24 years old, tall for a woman of her era, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned severely beneath a plain gray bonnet. Her eyes were the color of good creek water, not quite green, not quite hazel, but something particular to her alone. She had good hands, strong and capable, the kind that had known work since childhood, and she walked with the quiet, contained dignity of someone who had learned that dignity was the one thing nobody could actually take from you, no matter how hard they tried. She had come from Wichita. That was all people needed to know, apparently. In Wichita, Frances had been a dressmaker's assistant for 2 years, and before that she had taught school for 1 season in a small settlement south of Abilene. And before that she had been the only surviving child of Thomas and Miriam Barrett, who had come out to Kansas from Ohio with grand plans and very little luck. Her father had died of fever when she was 17, her mother of grief not long after, and Frances had done what young women alone in the world did in those days. She had found work, and she had kept her head down, and she had survived. The trouble in Wichita had not been of her making. That was the truth of it, plain and simple, though the truth in 1878 Kansas was rarely the thing that mattered most. What mattered was perception, and what people perceived was this. Frances Barrett had been engaged to a man named Douglas Crail, a moderately prosperous grain merchant with a good reputation and a roving eye, and when that engagement had ended, when Douglas Crail had broken it himself, citing reasons he never fully explained to anyone who asked directly, the town of Wichita had looked at Frances and decided collectively that the fault must be hers. There had been talk. There was always talk. Someone had seen her speaking too familiarly with a ranch hand. Someone else claimed she had been caught in a compromising situation behind the church social, though no one could name exactly who the other party had been or exactly what had been observed. The stories multiplied and shifted the way stories always do when they are not anchored to actual fact. And within 2 months of Douglas Crail announcing his engagement to a banker's daughter from Topeka, Frances Barrett had been thoroughly, comprehensively ruined in reputation if in nothing else. She had left Wichita because staying had become impossible. She had chosen Caldwell because it was far enough away that she thought perhaps the stories might not have traveled there yet. She had been wrong about that. A letter had preceded her, sent by some well-meaning but catastrophically misguided woman from Wichita's Ladies' Auxiliary who had a cousin in Caldwell. And by the time Frances stepped off the wagon that had carried her south along the Kisham Trail, the cousin had already made sure that the relevant parties in Caldwell knew exactly who was coming and exactly what her reputation supposedly was. Frances stood on the wooden boardwalk outside the Caldwell Hotel, her carpetbag at her feet, and looked at the town that was supposed to be her fresh start. A woman coming out of the dry goods store glanced at her, whispered something to the woman beside her, and both of them looked away quickly. A man in a decent suit slowed his walk, assessed her with an unpleasant frankness, and then moved on with a small, satisfied smile, the kind that said he had already filed her under a category in his mind and found the category useful. Frances picked up her carpetbag, straightened her spine, and walked into the hotel to ask about a room. The proprietor, a stout man named Caldwell, had a room available on the second floor. He told her the rate and accepted her payment with a neutrality that was itself a kind of cold statement. He would take her money, but he would not look at her with any warmth while doing it. She thanked him and carried her own bag up the stairs because no one offered to help. The room was clean, at least. There was a brass bed with a white coverlet, a small writing desk, and a window that looked out over Main Street. Frances sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands for a long moment, and then she unpacked her carpetbag with methodical care, hanging her 2 spare dresses on the hooks behind the door, setting her small sewing kit on the desk, placing her mother's Bible on the nightstand where she could see it when she woke. She had come to Caldwell because she had heard through a contact in Wichita that the town was in need of a school teacher, and teaching was the work she loved best. Children had not yet learned to treat her the way adults did. Children simply wanted to learn to read and to do their arithmetic and to hear stories about history and faraway places. And in a classroom, Frances was the best and most honest version of herself, patient and curious and genuinely joyful about the act of learning. She would present herself to the school board in the morning. She would be professional and competent, and they would see that. They would have to see that. She was still telling herself this with reasonable conviction when she fell asleep. She presented herself to the school board the following morning. There were 3 men on the board: Reverend Aldous Marsh, who ran the larger of the 2 churches, a cattle merchant named Silas Horn, and a banker named Franklin Prout. They received her in the back room of the church, which smelled of old wood and candle wax, and they asked her about her experience and her qualifications with the slightly over-formal courtesy that men use when they have already made a decision and are simply performing the courtesy of a process. Frances answered everything directly and honestly. She had her letter of reference from the school board in Abilene, where she had taught successfully for a full term. She had her certificate of qualification. She answered their questions about curriculum and discipline, and her views on the proper education of both boys and girls in a frontier community, and she answered all of it well, because she knew her work and she knew it thoroughly. Then Reverend Marsh cleared his throat and said, with a carefully arranged expression of regret, that the board had concerns about the fitness of any teacher who might set an inappropriate example for the children of the community. He did not say what he had heard. He simply said it in a way that made clear what he was referring to, and Frances felt the color rise in her face and had to work very hard to keep her voice level. She told them the stories they had heard were false. She told them her character was sound and had never been otherwise. She told them that Douglas Crail himself had never accused her of any impropriety, and that no one, if pressed to name a specific act or a specific witness, would be able to do so. Franklin Prout looked at the table. Silas Horn looked at the window. Reverend Marsh said he was very sorry, but the board would need to take the matter under advisement, and they would let her know their decision. She was standing outside the church 3 minutes later with her references and her certificate still in her hand, and the knowledge, cold and settled in her chest, that they would not hire her. They had already decided. She had simply been given the performance of consideration rather than its substance. She walked back to the hotel slowly, because walking quickly would have looked like fleeing, and she refused to flee. She passed the saloon and felt the eyes of 2 men on the porch tracking her progress. She passed the dry goods store and saw the woman from yesterday again, who looked away with that particular speed that communicated volumes. She passed the livery stable, which smelled of hay and horse and leather, and was at least honest about what it was. She passed the blacksmith's shop, and a man came out of it. She noticed him primarily because he was large, not in the exaggerated way of men who wanted to be noticed for their size, but simply physically substantial, broad through the shoulders in a way that came from actual work rather than performance. He was perhaps 28 or 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that was weathered and direct, with none of the calculating softness she had already learned to dread in this town. He was carrying a length of fence wire in one hand and a hammer in the other, and he walked with the unhurried certainty of a man who knew exactly where he was going and was comfortable in his own body getting there. He glanced at her as she passed. It was a glance, not a survey. There was no assessment in it, no filing away. He simply looked at her the way a person looks at another person, with a passing acknowledgement that she existed. And then his gaze moved on to the problem of the fence wire and the morning ahead of him. Frances walked another half a block before she realized that the simple neutrality of that glance had been the most decent thing anyone in Caldwell had given her since her arrival. She did not learn his name that day. She spent the next week looking for work. She asked at the dressmaker's shop, which was run by a woman named Adeline Pryor, who informed her with exaggerated regret that she had no positions available. She asked at the hotel about taking in laundry, and Garrett Howell told her the hotel had its own arrangements. She asked at the general store about a bookkeeping position that she had heard mentioned in passing, and was told by the owner, a man named Calhoun, that he needed someone trustworthy for that kind of work, and the pause before the word trustworthy told her everything. She was eating through her savings. She had enough for 2 more weeks in the hotel room, and then she would have very few options and none of them comfortable to think about. On the 8th day of her time in Caldwell, she was sitting at the small desk in her hotel room working on a letter to a contact in Dodge City who might know of teaching positions there, when she heard a knock at the door. It was a careful knock, neither demanding nor tentative. She opened the door to find a woman she had not met before, small and neat, perhaps 50 years old, with silver hair and a direct manner that was immediately distinct from the careful social navigation that seemed to characterize every other interaction Frances had had in Caldwell. The woman introduced herself as Ruth Kinney. She said she ran a small boarding house on the eastern edge of town, that she had heard Frances was looking for work, and that she had a proposition. Frances stepped back and invited her in. Ruth Kinney had been in Caldwell for 11 years, long enough to have formed her own opinions about most things independently of what the ladies' auxiliary or the Reverend Marsh thought about them. She needed someone to help her manage the boarding house cleaning, cooking, keeping the accounts, which had gotten beyond Ruth's patient management since her eyesight had started failing her. She offered room and board plus a small wage, with the understanding that Frances would have her own room, her own privacy, and Ruth's protection from any nonsense, which Ruth described in those exact words with the quiet confidence of someone who had delivered on that promise before. Frances asked her directly why she was offering this to someone whose reputation had apparently preceded her so thoroughly. Ruth Kinney looked at her steadily, and said that she had been in this territory long enough to know that reputations for women generally said more about the men who had generated them than about the women themselves, and that Frances Barrett had an honest face and steady hands, and Ruth Kinney had always trusted those 2 things more than gossip. Frances accepted. She moved into the boarding house the following morning, and it was immediately apparent that Ruth Kinney's establishment was nothing like the cold, watchful atmosphere of the hotel. There were 6 boarders, all working men, a telegraph operator, 2 ranch hands, a carpenter, a man who worked for the railroad, and a cattle buyer who came and went unpredictably. Ruth ran the house with cheerful practicality, with good food and clean linens, and a total intolerance for fighting or excessive drinking on the premises. The boarders had largely learned to behave themselves accordingly. Frances threw herself into the work with genuine relief. She cooked and cleaned and kept the accounts with meticulous care, and she read to Ruth in the evenings when Ruth's eyes were tired, and she felt, for the first time since leaving Wichita, like she was in a place that was at least stable. The town's judgment continued. She felt it when she went to the general store for supplies, when she attended Sunday service at the smaller church because Ruth attended there, and it was therefore more comfortable than Reverend Marsh's establishment. She felt it in the way conversations shifted slightly when she entered a room, in the way women found reasons not to introduce her to their husbands, in the careful social exclusion that was somehow more exhausting than outright cruelty, because it was always dressed in the language of polite regret. And then one afternoon in her third week at Ruth's boarding house, the man with the fence wire came to dinner. His name was Abel Hayes. He was one of the railroad man's friends, apparently, though he was not a railroad man himself. He was a rancher or trying to be one, as he put it with a straightforward lack of pretension when he introduced himself at the table. He had a small spread about 6 miles east of town, 140 acres that he was working largely alone with a hired hand named Percival, building up a herd that was currently at 32 head of cattle and climbing. He had come to Caldwell because he needed lumber for a new barn section, and had decided to take his dinner at Ruth's on the recommendation of the telegraph operator, whose name was Hector, and who ate at Ruth's regularly, and had opinions about the cooking that he shared freely. Abel Hayes sat at the far end of the long table and ate Ruth's beef stew with evident appreciation, and spoke to the other men at the table with an easiness that was not performance. He asked Hector about the latest news coming through on the telegraph with genuine curiosity. He asked the carpenter about a technique for post-setting in rocky soil with the focused attention of a man who actually needed the information and intended to use it. He laughed at something the railroad worker said, a genuine laugh, unrehearsed. Frances was serving the bread when he looked up and recognized her. Or rather, she saw the moment when he placed her the brief flicker of recognition that said he had seen her before, that particular morning on Main Street. There was no accompanying shift in his expression toward the careful distance she had become accustomed to reading in people's faces. He simply said, "You are Ruth's new help, then." Hector mentioned she had found someone good. Frances said she had been there about 3 weeks. He said Hector had been right, because the bread smelled exceptional. She thanked him and moved on to the next boarder, and that was all that happened. And yet she thought about it afterward in a way she would not have been able to fully explain, only that it had been uncomplicated. That interaction, in a way that nothing in the past month had been uncomplicated, and the absence of calculation in it had been striking. Abel Hayes came to dinner at Ruth's twice more that week, and then he made an arrangement with Ruth to take a room for the nights he needed to stay in town on business, rather than riding back to the ranch in the dark, which he did perhaps 2 or 3 times a month. Ruth gave him the corner room on the ground floor because it was easier for him to come and go with work hours, and he paid on time and never made trouble, and nodded to Frances in the mornings with the same uncomplicated neutrality that had struck her that first day on Main Street. She was careful. She had learned to be careful. Whatever she felt about the quiet competence of Abel Hayes, about the way he spoke directly without either flattering her or condescending to her, she held it at a distance and examined it with the wariness of someone who had been burned badly enough to respect fire. It was Hector, the telegraph operator, who accidentally began the unwinding of that careful distance. Hector was a pleasant, somewhat garrulous man who valued Ruth's dinner table partly for the food, and partly because it was one of the few places in Caldwell where people actually talked to each other rather than performing social roles at each other. He had been in Caldwell for 4 years, and he knew everyone and held strong opinions about most of them, and he had no gift whatsoever for discretion. One evening at dinner, when Frances was clearing plates and Abel was still at the table with his coffee, Hector was telling a story about something he had heard at the saloon the night prior, and the story involved a group of men making remarks about Frances that were unkind in the specific, calculated way of men who wanted to diminish someone, and had found a socially acceptable vehicle for doing so. Hector was telling the story because he found it outrageous, which he genuinely did, but he had not fully thought through the consequence of telling it in front of the person it was about, and Frances had gone very still at the kitchen door. She did not make a sound. She stood with her hands wrapped around a stack of plates, and she kept her face composed with the long practice of someone who had learned that composure was the only defense available to her, and she looked at a point on the far wall and breathed. It was Abel who spoke. He set his coffee cup down on the table with a small, precise sound that cut through Hector's story, and he said, in a voice that was quiet and absolutely flat, "Hector, stop." Hector stopped. Abel did not look at Frances, which she understood almost immediately was intentional. He was not making her the focus of the moment, was not inviting her to perform gratitude or distress for an audience. He was simply addressing the situation in the room with the directness of a man who saw something wrong and found the capacity to name it without ceremony. He said to Hector that he would appreciate it if stories of that nature did not come to this dinner table, because they were neither true nor useful, and they had no business being repeated by decent people. He said it plainly, without anger and without drama, and then he picked up his coffee cup again. Hector looked thoroughly abashed and said he had only meant to express his own indignation, which Abel acknowledged with a brief nod, and then the conversation moved on. Frances finished clearing the plates. She went to the kitchen and stood at the basin for a moment looking at the soap and the water and the stacked dishes, and she felt something crack open slightly in the careful architecture she had built around herself. She did not cry. She had not cried since leaving Wichita, but she felt the pressure of it, the hot specific pressure that lives behind the eyes when something that has been held very tightly is touched unexpectedly by something kind. She washed the dishes methodically, and did not go back out to the dining room until she was entirely composed. That night Ruth asked her if she was all right, because Ruth noticed everything, and Frances said she was fine, thank you, and Ruth looked at her in the particular way she had that communicated "I will not press you, but I am here," and Frances was grateful for both things. 2 days later she was in the small kitchen garden behind the boarding house, pulling early weeds from between the rows of kitchen herbs that Ruth grew along the south-facing wall, when she heard boots on the path behind her and looked up to find Abel Hayes crouching down at the garden's edge with a cup of coffee in each hand. He offered her one. She looked at it for a moment, then wiped her hands on her apron and accepted. He settled himself onto the low stone wall that bordered the garden and looked at the mountains in the distance visible from here on a clear day, blue and remote, and said that the weather looked like it would hold good for another week at least, which was good for his barn construction. She asked how the barn was coming. He said it was coming slowly, because lumber was expensive and he was working on a careful budget, but that the frame was solid, and that was what mattered most. She asked about his ranch, and he told her about it, the 140 acres, the creek that ran along the eastern edge and provided reliable water, the 32 cattle that he intended to build to 100 by next year. He spoke about the land with a particular quality in his voice, not sentiment exactly, but something close to it, the quality of a man who has found the thing he was meant to do and is doing it. She asked how long he had been there. He said 2 years. He had come from Missouri, where he had farmed his family's land alongside his father until his father died, and the farm had been sold to cover debts, and he had taken his share of what remained and come west because he had wanted land of his own, something he had built himself, and Kansas had offered the possibility of that. Frances sat on the other end of the stone wall with her coffee and said that she understood wanting something of your own that you had made yourself. He looked at her when she said that, not with the assessing look she had learned to dread, but with the steady attention of someone who is actually listening, who takes what you have said seriously enough to consider it rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. He said he had heard things about her situation. He did not say what he had heard or from whom, and that he would not pretend he hadn't, but that he did not put a great deal of stock in what he heard from people who had not witnessed things themselves. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the defensive preparation. She said that people seemed to find the stories very credible. He said that in his experience, the things people found most credible were the things that required the least of them. That it was easier to believe a story that meant you did not have to extend yourself to anyone new, especially anyone who made your own situation feel complicated. He said he thought Caldwell was a town that was very comfortable with easy. Frances looked at her coffee. She said that was a generous interpretation of something that felt a great deal less generous when you were on the receiving end of it. He said he imagined it did, and he said it in a way that was not dismissive but was simply an acknowledgement of fact. Yes, this has been unjust, I see that, and I am not going to dress it up as something else. They sat in the kitchen garden for another 15 minutes talking about other things, about the wildflowers she had noticed along the road out of town, and whether he knew what they were, about Ruth's particular method for herb growing, about what the winter in Kansas was like, which she had not yet experienced. They talked like two people who were simply in a place together at the same time and found each other easy company, and when he stood to leave for the livery to collect his horse, he said he would see her at dinner the next time he was in town. She said she would look forward to it, and she meant it with a simplicity that surprised her a little. She thought about it afterward, about what he had said regarding the brand that had been put on her by the county's collective judgment. He had not said the thing she had expected, which was either defensive agreement with the gossip dressed in kind language, or elaborate chivalric dismissal that treated her as a project to be rescued. He had simply said the brand was wrong. He had said it the way he had said everything, directly, without theater, with the total plainness of someone who simply meant what he said. It was, she realized, the first time anyone in Caldwell had said it to her face. She allowed herself, cautiously, to be grateful. Over the following weeks, Abel Hayes came to Ruth's boarding house with increasing frequency, and Frances found herself looking forward to those evenings with an honesty that she tried to keep proportionate and was not entirely succeeding. He was good company. He was intelligent in a practical way and curious in a broader way, and he read, which she found she had not expected and was glad of. He had a small collection of books that lived in a saddlebag when he traveled, which he had shown her one evening when she had asked about a title she had noticed him carrying. A worn copy of Hart's Sketches, which he had read twice through and was considering reading again. She told him she had loved Hart when she had first encountered him in school, and they had talked about it for nearly an hour while Ruth sat in the corner of the parlor with her mending, listening with the entirely transparent expression of a woman who was very pleased about something and trying not to show it. He asked her one evening, in the garden again because the weather had turned genuinely warm, why she had wanted to teach. She told him about the school in Abilene, about the children there, about a girl named Maria who had arrived not speaking English and by the end of the term had been reading simple sentences aloud with a focus and pride that Frances still thought about. She told him about the particular satisfaction of watching someone understand something they had not understood before, the way understanding opened in a person's face like a door swinging wide into daylight. She said it was the best work she had ever done, and she missed it more than she could properly explain. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that it seemed to him that if Caldwell had a teacher like her available and was choosing not to use her, that was Caldwell's considerable loss, and that he personally found such a decision reflective very poorly on the school board's judgment. She smiled at that. She had been smiling more easily lately, she noticed. She asked him once, because she had decided that his particular quality of directness invited the same in return, why he extended her the courtesy that the rest of the town did not. She asked it plainly, without performance, just wanting to know. He considered it for a moment. He said that he had grown up watching his mother carry a similar kind of judgment from people who had made assumptions about her character that were not based on anything real, and that it had caused her real harm and real sorrow, and that he had decided somewhere in the course of watching that when he was old enough to choose, He would choose to look at people as they actually were rather than as rumor said they were. He said that Frances Barrett, as she actually was, seemed to him to be a capable, honest, intelligent woman who had been badly used by the stories of people with too much time and too little conscience, and he saw no reason to add his name to the list of people who had treated her otherwise. Frances looked at him for a long moment. She said thank you in a voice that was steady, but required some effort to make so. He said there was no need to thank him for basic decency, and that line struck her as so exactly, quietly true that she held it for days afterward, turning it over in her mind. The trouble with Silas Horn began in June. Silas Horn was the cattle merchant from the school board, a prosperous and self-important man of 45 who had always looked at Frances with the particular combination of speculation and contempt that certain men apply to women whose reputations have been questioned. The look that suggests they are simultaneously judging and calculating. Frances had tried to have as little to do with him as possible. But Horn had business with the railroad man who boarded at Ruth's, and this brought him to the boarding house one evening when Frances was working at the front desk going over Ruth's accounts. He came in and saw her, and she felt his presence in the room immediately, the way one feels a change in air pressure. He made a remark. She would not have been able to say afterward whether it was specifically designed to wound, or whether it simply came naturally to him. The implication in the tone, the suggestion that a woman of her standing ought to be grateful for whatever situation she found herself in, the particular phrasing that managed to be technically unprovable while conveying exactly what it meant to convey. Frances set her pen down and looked at him and said, very quietly, that she would appreciate it if he would keep a civil tongue while he was under this roof. He smiled at her in a way that was worse than any insult, and then the door from the back hall opened and Abel came through it. He had arrived earlier that afternoon and had been out at the livery, and he read the room immediately, the way Frances was standing, the way Horn was smiling. He crossed to the front desk and stood beside Frances with the naturalness of someone who simply occupied the space next to her as a matter of course, and he looked at Silas Horn and said that he did not believe they had met properly, and introduced himself as Abel Hayes from the Hayes Ranch east of town, and he shook Horn's hand with the measured firmness of a man who is being entirely polite and entirely clear simultaneously. He said he had just come to speak with Frances about the account he had with Ruth, which was completely true. He did have a small account he settled monthly, and he included her in the conversation in a way that repositioned her instantly, that made her the person conducting legitimate business in her own workplace, rather than the person standing exposed under someone's unpleasant scrutiny. Horn, who was not a stupid man, understood what had just happened. The smile dropped. He found his reason to leave shortly thereafter. When the door closed behind him, Abel leaned against the front desk and did not say anything for a moment, and Frances stood beside him with her hands flat on the account book and breathed. She said, "You did not have to do that." He said, "I know." She said, "Thank you." He said it again, that there was no need to thank him for basic decency. But this time he said it with something underneath it that was different from the first time, a rougher warmth that was less philosophical and more personal. And when she looked up at him, she found him looking at her with an expression she had not seen before, which was different from his usual directness, and which she was fairly sure she understood correctly, and which made her heart beat in a manner she had been trying very hard to keep properly managed. She looked back at the account book. He said he did actually need to settle his account. She pulled out the ledger. They were very businesslike about it and did not mention anything else, and when he went upstairs, Frances sat at the front desk for a while looking at the accounts page in front of her and not seeing the numbers at all. Ruth came in from the kitchen after about 10 minutes and looked at Frances and said, without any preamble, "That is a good man." Frances said she was aware. Ruth said, "Good," and went back to the kitchen, and that was the entirety of the conversation, but it covered everything necessary. It was in July that Frances encountered the school board situation again, and this time it was not the school board who came to her, but rather the circumstances that brought her to them. There was a fire at the schoolhouse, not a catastrophic fire, but enough to damage the back section significantly, and in the aftermath the school board found themselves without a full teaching solution, because the teacher they had hired, a young man from out of state, had left Caldwell after 2 months, citing the difficulty of managing 30 children across all grades in a single room. The board sent a message asking if Frances might be willing to provide temporary instruction while they arranged a permanent solution. Frances took the message to Ruth, who said what she thought about the timing and the hypocrisy of it in several very well-chosen sentences. Then Frances asked her if she should do it. Ruth said that the children needed a teacher and Frances was the best teacher available, and that the politics of the school board were between them and their own consciences, and that Frances's place in Caldwell would be better served by demonstrating her quality to the whole town than by declining on principle, satisfying as the decline might feel. Frances thought about it for 2 days. She talked to Abel about it one evening on the front porch of the boarding house, where they had fallen into the habit of sitting after dinner when the evenings were warm enough. She told him the full situation, the initial rejection, the way it had been handled, the current request, and asked for his honest opinion. He said that Ruth was right about the children. He said he also thought she should do it, but he said that if she did it, she should do it on her own terms, and that meant she should go to the school board and make absolutely clear that she expected to be treated with the same professional respect as any other teacher they would hire, and that she would accept nothing less. She said she was not sure the school board would respond well to that kind of directness from her. He said he was not sure they would either, but that it was worth establishing from the beginning rather than allowing the same dynamic to recreate itself. He said, and this was the thing that stayed with her, that the brand people had put on her was wrong, and that taking the job with her head down would in some small way reinforce it, whereas taking the job with her head up and her terms clear would begin the process of replacing it with something true. She said, "You sound very certain." He said he was not certain about the outcome, only about what she deserved. She went to the school board the following morning. She went to Reverend Marsh's office and she laid out her terms, professional respect, a formal letter of appointment, adequate supplies for the classroom, and a clear salary. She said she was willing to discuss the situation honestly with all 3 board members present, but she was not willing to take the position under the same terms of uncertain standing that had characterized their first conversation. Reverend Marsh looked uncomfortable. Franklin Prout looked at his hands. Silas Horn, who was present because he was still on the board, looked at her with the assessment she had learned to read and then looked away. There was a discussion. It was not entirely comfortable. But at the end of it, Frances Barrett had a letter of appointment and a starting date of the first Monday in August. She walked back to the boarding house on a July morning with the letter in her hand and the sun on her face, and she felt something in her chest that she had not felt in a long time, which was hope that was not hedged or qualified or tentative, but simply real. Abel was in the stable yard when she came through the gate, working on the wheel of a small cart that Ruth used for hauling supplies. He looked up and she held up the letter and said simply, "I have the position." He put down the wrench in his hand and he smiled, a full, genuine smile that she had not seen from him before, the reserved quality completely absent, and it transformed his face in a way that made her chest do something entirely unmanageable. He said, "Good. Those children are lucky," she said. "We will see about that," he said. "I am entirely certain of it." She went inside before she did anything she had not yet decided to do. That evening at dinner, Ruth made an apple cake because Ruth said it was a celebration, and it was, and the boarders were all informed of the news and expressed varying degrees of congratulation. And Hector said he had always known the school board would come around because they were not actually fools even if they had behaved like them. and the evening was warm and easy in a way that Frances stored in her memory carefully, a specific kind of happy. August came and the schoolroom was repaired, and Frances stood at the front of 31 children on the first morning with her roll book in her hand and felt entirely herself, entirely competent, entirely in the right place. The children were a rough and varied group, the children of cattle ranchers and merchants and railroad workers and a few homesteaders from the surrounding territory, and they were by turns eager and stubborn and loud and surprisingly perceptive, and she was exactly where she wanted to be. Word spread, as word does. Frances Barrett ran a good school. The children came home talking about what they had learned. Parents who had kept a careful distance from her began, cautiously, to engage. A woman named Clara Tibbs, whose son was in Frances's class, stopped her after church one Sunday to say that Daniel had never been interested in reading and was now reading at the dinner table and refusing to stop. And Clara's voice had the genuine pleasure of a mother who has watched her child discover something wonderful. And Frances felt that accomplishment more than any number of social rehabilitations could have produced. The social rehabilitation came anyway, slowly and unevenly, the way it does in small towns where public opinion is a ship that turns gradually rather than sharply. People began to greet her on the street without the pointed looking away. The wives of the school board members began to acknowledge her at church, then to exchange brief pleasantries, then to actually have short conversations. The ladies' auxiliary, which had been the source of much of the original difficulty, sent a member to ask if Frances would be willing to assist with the harvest social in September. She said she would be glad to. Ruth observed all of this with a dry satisfaction and occasionally said things like, "I told you," without any particular need for acknowledgement, because Ruth was right often enough that she had learned not to require ceremony about it. And Abel Hayes came to dinner at Ruth's boarding house, and they sat on the porch in the evenings and talked about everything they could think of. And the space between them on the porch bench had been shortening gradually throughout August without either of them making a decision about it. And by early September it was close enough that, when she reached for the glass of water she had brought out, her hand brushed his and they both went very still. Neither of them moved away. She looked at her hand and then at him, and he was looking at her with that expression she had seen in June, the one underneath his usual directness, and it was considerably more pronounced now, warm and particular and entirely serious. She said, "Abel." He said, "Frances." There was a pause that lasted approximately 3 heartbeats. She said, "I should tell you that I have been very careful for a long time, and that being careful has been the right strategy for a long time, and that I am finding it increasingly difficult to maintain." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he had been careful too, and that he had been careful specifically because he was aware of the position she was in, and he had not wanted to add to any pressure she felt, and that his own feelings on the subject had become impossible to misread even by himself. She said, "What are your feelings exactly?" He said, "I think you are the most honest person I have met in this territory, and the most capable, and I find every evening I spend in your company to be the best part of my day, and I have thought about you more or less continuously since that conversation in the kitchen garden in May, and I would like, if you are willing, to court you properly." The last 2 words landed with a formality that she recognized as intentional and deliberate. He was not suggesting something informal or ambiguous. He was offering something real with a real name on it. She looked at him for a long moment. She said yes. He reached over and covered her hand with his, and they sat on the porch of Ruth Kinney's boarding house in the early September dark with their hands linked, and the sound of the Kansas night around them, and the lights of Caldwell making small, warm squares in the dark. And Frances felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for so long she had almost forgotten what settled felt like. Ruth came to the door approximately 5 minutes later with the stated purpose of checking whether they wanted more coffee, and took one look at their joined hands, and went back inside with an expression of profound personal satisfaction. The courtship was, by the standards of Caldwell, fairly unconventional. They did not perform it for the town's benefit. They did not announce it. They simply continued the evenings on the porch and the conversations that had become habitual, except that now there was nothing withheld, no careful management of what she let herself feel, and the relief of that was something she felt in her whole body. He took her riding one Saturday morning in October. She had learned to ride in childhood and had missed it, and he had a gentle brown mare named Biscuit that he said was trustworthy for someone who was not riding every day, which turned out to be a polite understatement because Biscuit was the most agreeable horse Frances had ever encountered. He showed her the ranch on that ride, the full extent of it, the creek along the eastern boundary that ran shallow and clear, the place where the new barn section was finally finished, the wide flat field that he said he planned to turn to hay next year for winter feed. He talked about it with the same quality she had noticed that first day in the garden, the voice of a man who has found the thing he was meant for. But he listened too, in the way she had come to rely on, and she told him about the ranch her father had tried to establish in Ohio before the family had come west, about what she remembered of it, about the specific quality of afternoon light on flat fields that she had not thought about in years, but which came back to her clearly on that October morning. He was quiet after she described it, and then he said that the light over this land hit the grass in the early morning in a way that she might find worth seeing, and he said it with the specific confidence of someone who is sharing something they value and is certain it will be valued in return. She said she would like to see that. He said he would show her. In November, he came to Ruth's with a particular look about him. She had learned his face well enough now to read the variations in it, the contained agitation that meant he was thinking hard about something and had been thinking hard about it for some time. She was in the kitchen when he arrived, and Ruth, who had also learned to read him, told her he was in the parlor and suggested Frances might want to go through. She found him by the parlor window looking at the street outside, his hat in both hands, turning it in the familiar way he did when he was thinking. She said, "What is it?" He turned around and looked at her. He said, "I have something to ask you, and I want to ask it the right way, and I want you to know before I ask it that whatever your answer is, I will respect it completely." She sat down in the parlor chair and waited, because that was the right response. He said that he had been thinking about his ranch and about the future, and about what he wanted the future to look like, and that increasingly what he wanted it to look like included her, specifically her, not a general idea of a wife or a partner but Frances Barrett, who was herself, and not a replacement for anything or a solution to a problem, but simply the person he wanted to share his life with because she was the best person he knew. He said he understood that she had been through something that had made trust difficult, and that she had worked to build something of her own here that was genuinely hers, her position at the school, her place at Ruth's, the standing she had created through her own work and character, and that he was not asking her to give any of that up. He said the schoolhouse in Caldwell was 6 miles from his ranch and that was a manageable distance, and that Ruth Kinney was a permanent fixture as far as he was concerned, and he hoped she always would be. Then he said, "Frances, I would very much like you to marry me if you will have me." Frances looked at him. She looked at his hands on the hat, which had gone still. She looked at his face, which was open and entirely readable hope and nervousness, and the specific earnestness of a man who is not performing but simply feeling what he feels. She said, "Abel Hayes, I believe you are the best man I have met in this territory, and I believe you mean everything you say, which is rarer than it ought to be, and I have been in love with you since you sat on that stone wall in May with 2 cups of coffee and talked to me like I was a person." His face changed. The contained quality he carried broke open into something full and unguarded and warm. She said, "Yes." He crossed the room and took her hands, and she stood up from the chair, and they were standing very close together in Ruth's parlor with the November light coming through the window. And he said her name once, quietly, the way he said things when they mattered most, and she said his name back. Ruth was in the hallway for the second time in recent memory, and she said in a carrying voice that she was going to start supper, and that there was no need to rush anything. They told the boarders at dinner that evening. Hector nearly knocked over his coffee with enthusiasm. The railroad worker shook Abel's hand vigorously. Even the cattle buyer, who was generally phlegmatic, said it was fine news. Ruth sat at the head of the table and said she had known since May and had been very patient, and Abel said she had been magnificent about it, and Ruth said she knew that too. The wedding was set for March, because winter in Kansas was not an ideal time for celebrations, and March meant the first genuinely hopeful weather of the year, which seemed right for it. The period between the engagement and the wedding was not without its difficulties. There were people in Caldwell who expressed their opinions about the match in ways that ranged from concerned to openly contemptuous, and most of those opinions were about Frances rather than about Abel, about whether someone with her reputation was a suitable wife for a man who was building something real. Sela's horn apparently said something at the saloon that was repeated to Abel by 3 different people, which Abel addressed by going to find Horn directly and having a private conversation that he declined to describe in detail, but after which Horn was conspicuously less communicative on the subject. Abel told Frances about this afterward, and she asked him what he had said. He said he had told Horn that the reputation Frances carried was a false brand put on her by people who had not had the decency to look past their own assumptions, and that he would be grateful if Horn would keep his opinions about his future wife to himself. She looked at him for a moment and said, "You have said that before, about the brand being wrong." He said he had because it was true. She said, "Every man in this county has treated it as though it were real." He said, "Every man in this county has been wrong." She reached up and touched his face then, in the kitchen at Ruth's boarding house on a December evening with the stove burning and the smell of supper in the air, and the sound of the boarders moving around in the rooms above them, and she said, "Do you know what it has meant to me that you saw that?" He turned his face slightly into her hand and said he thought he might know, and he hoped it would keep meaning something for a long time to come, because he intended to keep saying it as long as it needed saying. She kissed him. For the first time properly, with both hands on his face and his hands coming up to her waist with the care of a man who is holding something he knows is valuable, and it was warm and certain and entirely right. And in the kitchen at Ruth Kinney's boarding house in Caldwell, Kansas in December of 1878, Frances Barrett felt completely safe for the first time in 2 years. The winter passed with the particular intimacy of a couple who know they are building toward something. Abel came to town every week, and they spent the evenings in the parlor reading, or talking, or helping Ruth with whatever project she had undertaken. Frances went to the ranch twice before the wedding, both times with Ruth as escort, because propriety still mattered in ways they were both willing to navigate, and saw the house that Abel was adding a new room to in anticipation, a large, light-filled room at the back of the house with a window that faced east for the morning light he had promised her. She stood in the unfinished room on a cold January afternoon looking at the view the window would frame, the flat winter fields, the line of the creek, the sky that in Kansas seemed to go on forever in every direction, and she felt the particular quality of knowing she was home, that specific emotional recognition that has nothing to do with familiarity and everything to do with rightness. Abel stood behind her and said, "Well," she said, "I think it will do." He laughed and she turned around and they stood in the half-built room laughing together in the cold, and his hired hand Percival, a quiet and taciturn man of about 40 who had been working with Abel since the first year, came to the door to ask a question and then stopped, looked at them, said "right then," and walked back the way he had come. The wedding was on the 14th of March, 1879. It was held at the smaller church, the one Ruth attended, whose minister was a kind man named Reverend Cowles, who had never treated Frances with anything but courtesy. And the attendance was interesting as a measure of how much Caldwell had changed its position since August. Ruth was there, of course, the first person in the front pew. All the boarders from the house were there. Clara Tibbs was there with her son Daniel, who had brought a book. The carpenter and the telegraph operator Hector sat together, and Hector cried a little, which he later denied. Several of the mothers from the school were there. Several families from the surrounding ranching community who had come to know Abel were there. Even some people who had not been kind came, which Frances chose to interpret as a form of acknowledgement, a grudging recognition that the narrative they had built about her was less defensible now that she was standing in a church in a good cream-colored dress with flowers in her hair, and a man beside her who looked at her the way Abel Hayes looked at her. Reverend Cowles asked the question, and Frances said her words in a clear voice, and Abel said his in the direct, unhurried way he said everything that mattered. And when they were pronounced married and Abel took her hands and kissed her with the careful warmth that she had come to know as entirely his own, she heard Ruth make a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a statement. Which was the most overtly emotional thing Ruth Kinney had done in Frances's presence, and which made her chest full to an almost untenable degree. She was Frances Hayes when she walked out of that church. She thought of the carpetbag and the gray bonnet and the cold eyes of the hotel proprietor and the school board's performance of consideration. And she thought of the kitchen garden and the 2 cups of coffee and a man who had sat on a stone wall and talked to her like she was a person. And she felt the distance between those 2 mornings as a measure of something very large. Abel helped her into the wagon outside the church and then got up beside her and took the reins. And Hector threw something that was supposed to be rice, but turned out to be mostly dried corn, because this was Kansas, and Hector had worked with what he had. And Ruth stood on the steps with her hands folded in front of her, and watched them go with an expression that was entirely content, the expression of someone who has done a thing right and knows it. They drove out to the ranch in the March afternoon, the light long and clean and golden over the grass. And Frances sat beside Abel on the wagon bench with her hand through his arm, and her face turned up to the sky that went on forever. The first year of their marriage was hard work and great happiness, which was the general condition of ranching life in late 1870s Kansas, and which suited them both. Frances continued her teaching position because they had both agreed that it was her work and she loved it, and the 6 miles was manageable. And she rode Biscuit the mare to Caldwell 4 days a week during the school year, and came home in the late afternoons to the house that now smelled of wood smoke and bread, and the particular smell of a home that is being genuinely lived in. Abel's herd grew. By the end of 1879, he had 68 cattle and the hay field had been planted and harvested, and the new barn section was housing 2 additional horses. Percival, who had turned out to have a dry and considerable wit that revealed itself slowly over the course of many meals, had started coming to supper on Sundays, and those Sundays had become a small standing tradition. Sometimes Ruth came out from town, sometimes Hector, sometimes Clara Tibbs and Daniel. Frances planted a garden along the south wall of the house, kitchen herbs first because that was practical, and then flowers because beauty was also practical in ways that couldn't always be measured. In the spring of 1880, Frances discovered she was expecting a child. She told Abel on a Sunday morning in April, before anyone else had arrived for supper, standing in the garden in the early light he had promised her, the eastern sky turning from gray to gold to the particular brilliant blue of a Kansas spring morning. His face went through several things in rapid succession: surprise, and then something profound and almost overwhelmed, and then the quiet, settled joy that was the deepest register of who he was. He said, "Frances." She said she knew. It was a great deal all at once. He put both arms around her and held her, and she put her head against his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was steady and present and entirely real. she said, muffled slightly against his shirt. "I would like it to be a boy, I think." He said he would like it to be whatever it was going to be, and that this was the only philosophical position that made any practical sense, and she laughed against his chest and felt his laugh come through his ribs under her hands. Ruth, when she was told, sat down in her chair and breathed out slowly through her nose and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a woman receiving news she has been hoping for. And then she said that she would need to start knitting, and that she had not knitted anything in 3 years, and her hands were going to need to remember themselves. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which Frances was grateful for in the matter-of-fact way she was grateful for things that went well, thoroughly, and without drama. She taught through the summer, then took a leave from the school in September when the distance on horseback became less advisable, and spent the autumn at the ranch doing the accounts and the correspondence and the approximately 1,000 other things that needed doing on a working cattle ranch and could be done without riding. In November of 1880, Thomas Abel Hayes arrived into the world on a cold and brilliantly clear morning in the bedroom of the Hayes ranch house, with Ruth Kinney in attendance, along with the doctor from Caldwell who rode out on short notice and was entirely competent and earned his fee. He weighed 8 pounds and had his father's dark hair and his mother's cream-colored eyes, and he announced his arrival with a volume that suggested he had opinions and intended to express them. Frances held him against her chest in the quiet that followed all the noise and effort, and Abel sat beside the bed with his elbows on his knees and his hands pressed together and looked at the two of them with an expression that was simply love, undisguised and entire, the kind of thing that does not require any language. Frances looked at the baby and then at Abel and said, "Thomas, this is your father. He is the best man I know." Abel put his hand over hers on the baby's back. Ruth, who was by the window tidying things with her usual practical energy, said without turning around that she had not cried since 1871, and she intended to maintain that record, and then she wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her wrist and continued tidying. The winter that followed was the warm, enclosed kind of winter that comes to people who have everything they need inside 4 walls: fire and food and work, and each other. Thomas Hayes was a vigorous and opinionated infant who developed strong feelings about meal timing and the specific quality of the singing he preferred, which was extensive, and Abel sang to him on the porch in the evenings with a complete absence of self-consciousness that Frances found so deeply endearing it was occasionally almost painful. In the spring of 1881, when Thomas was 5 months old, and had developed the habit of sitting propped against pillows with an expression of intense observation, as though he were taking notes on the world for future reference, Frances returned to teaching. Ruth came to the ranch 2 days a week to help with Thomas, which Ruth presented as doing Frances a favor, and which everyone understood was also entirely for Ruth's own benefit, because Thomas Hayes had become the most interesting occupant of her world within approximately 3 hours of first meeting him. The school in Caldwell was by now Frances's in a way that went beyond employment. She had been there long enough that she was the constant, and the teachers who had been hired over her the first time were memories. The school board had changed. Silas Horn had moved to Topeka on business that required his permanent removal from Caldwell, which the town bore with considerable equanimity, and his replacement on the board was a man who had a daughter in Frances's class and who spoke of Frances with the warm respect of a parent who has seen what she does for children. Reverend Marsh had softened considerably over 2 years, as men sometimes do when the evidence continuously contradicts their position, and had told Frances at the Harvest Social of 1880 that the school was fortunate to have her, which was not entirely sufficient but was real. The life they were building was accumulative in the best way, layer by layer, season by season, each thing added making the whole more solid. Abel's herd reached 120 head in 1881, and he hired a second hand, a young man of 19 named Cobb who was good with horses and learning cattle, and who ate supper at the ranch table with the frank appreciation of someone who had been feeding himself badly for too long. Abel paid him fairly and treated him decently, and Cobb became loyal to the ranch with the wholehearted loyalty of someone for whom fair treatment was not a given, and had therefore been genuinely moved by it. One evening in late summer of 1881, Frances was sitting on the porch after supper with Thomas on her lap, who was 9 months old and very interested in the moths attracted to the lamp, when Abel came out and sat beside her, and said that Horn, before his departure to Topeka, had apparently made one final attempt to say something unpleasant about Frances to Franklin Pruitt, and that Pruitt had told him, with what Pruitt had described to Abel as a moderate degree of firmness, that Frances Hayes was the finest teacher Caldwell had ever had, and that he found Horn's opinions on the subject not worth his time. Frances looked at the moth that Thomas was reaching for with both hands. She said, "Franklin Pruitt." Abel said he had been surprised too, but that people sometimes found their better instincts eventually. She said, "I suppose they do." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You know what I have been thinking about?" She said she did not. He said he had been thinking about the morning she walked into Caldwell with a carpetbag and a bonnet and every door shut in her face, and about the fact that she had stood up under every single part of it, and that he thought it was one of the bravest things he had ever witnessed even though he had only seen a small part of it. She looked at him. He said, "I am proud to know you, Frances. I want to say that plainly because I think it ought to be said plainly." She reached over and took his hand and held it, and Thomas grabbed one of Abel's fingers and held that, and the three of them sat on the porch of the Hayes Ranch in the summer dark of 1881 and listened to the night. She said after a while, "I used to think about what it would take to make the brand go away, to make people unsee what they had decided they saw." He said, "And now?" She said, "Now I think the brand is already gone, not because they all decided it was wrong, though some of them have, but because I know it was wrong and you know it was wrong, and that turned out to be enough." He squeezed her hand. Thomas dropped Abel's finger, found it again, held it tighter this time with the focused satisfaction of someone who has solved a problem. Abel said, "More than enough." The years that followed were good years, the kind that get richer in the memory rather than thinner. In 1883, Frances had their second child, a girl they named Miriam Ruth, Miriam for Frances's mother, Ruth for the woman who had opened a door when every other door was closed. And Miriam was born in the same bedroom as Thomas and was announced to the world with the same vigorous opinion about existence. Ruth Kinney, when the name was told to her, said nothing for approximately 15 seconds and then said, "That is entirely unnecessary and I am completely honored," which was as close to overwhelmed as Ruth had been since the night of the wedding, and Frances held her hand and meant every syllable of both names. Thomas, at 3 years old, received his sister with the focused scrutiny of someone conducting a serious evaluation, and then declared that she could stay, which Abel said was a relief. The boarding house in Caldwell continued under Ruth's management, and by 1884 Ruth had taken on a young woman of 22 named Harriet as her permanent assistant, which freed Ruth to come to the ranch more often, and allowed the Hayes Ranch Sunday suppers to become a rather larger affair than they had begun as Ruth and Harriet. Hector, who had gotten himself a wife by 1882 and brought her along, Percival. Cobb, who was now 23 and had started making specific excuses to be at the ranch on Sunday afternoons coinciding with Harriet's visits, which no one mentioned directly but everyone observed. The school grew too. Caldwell was growing, the cattle trade was strong, the railroad brought new families, and by 1884 the school had enough pupils to warrant a second teacher, and Frances worked with the board to hire a young woman from Topeka who was capable and serious, and whom Frances mentored with the particular pleasure of passing something forward. One September afternoon in 1884, Frances was at the school after the children had left. writing on the chalkboard the next day's lesson, a history lesson about the settlement of the Western Territories, which she taught honestly, including the parts that were complicated, because she believed children deserved to understand the world they were inheriting. When the door opened and Abel came in. He came to the school sometimes when he was in town and their hours aligned, and she always felt the particular pleasure of seeing him appear in the doorway, which had not dimmed in 6 years, but had, if anything, deepened into something more settled and certain than the early sharp brightness of it. He sat in one of the students' chairs, which was considerably too small for him and which he acknowledged with a rueful look, and watched her write on the chalkboard for a moment. He said, "I remember you telling me about Maria, the girl in Abilene who learned to read." She said she remembered. He said, "Do you think you will ever go back to teaching somewhere else, or is Caldwell enough?" She turned from the chalkboard and looked at him. She said, "Caldwell is home. The children here are my children, not like Thomas and Miriam, but in another way that is also real." Why? He said there was nothing particular behind the question, only that he had been thinking about what she had said about finding the work she was meant for, and that he liked knowing she had found it. She said, "Have you found what you were meant for?" He said, "I found my land and I found my work and I found you, and the three of them together have made me happier than I had believed a person could practically be." She set down the chalk and crossed the room to where he was sitting in the too small chair, and looked at him for a moment with all the accumulated knowing of 6 years. His face and his voice, and the quality of his attention and the warmth he carried underneath the directness. The man she had met on a morning in 1878 when she had nothing, and he had given her nothing more and nothing less than the decency of being seen clearly. She said, "I love you, Abel Hayes." He said, "I love you, Francis Hayes." And he said it in the same voice he used for everything that mattered, most quiet and direct and entirely meant. She sat on the edge of the teacher's desk, and they talked for a while about the ranch, and the children and Ruth's latest theory about the winter hay supply, and Cobb's increasingly transparent feelings about Harriet. And the afternoon light came through the school windows and lay on the dusty floorboards in the long golden angles of September. And it was an ordinary afternoon, and it was a perfectly extraordinary one, the way the best afternoons are. Thomas Hayes started school at Francis's school in the fall of 1885, at 5 years old, and it produced in the county of Sumner, Kansas, a great deal of amused commentary about whether Mrs. Hayes would be a harder or easier teacher for her own son, which commentary Francis dispatched by treating Thomas exactly as she treated any other student, and Thomas by turning out to have an absolute passion for mathematics that suggested he had been listening to the accounts being calculated at the kitchen table for years. Miriam, who was 2 years behind her brother, and watching everything he did with the focused attention that would become her defining characteristic, announced at age 3 that she was also going to go to school, and that she was going to be better at reading than Thomas, which Thomas disputed, and which kept the kitchen table lively for approximately the next decade. Abel expanded the ranch in 1886, purchasing an adjoining 40 acres that became available when the family who had been homesteading it decided to go further west. The total was now 180 acres. The herd was at 210 head, and Cobb had by this point formally asked Harriet to marry him, and she had said yes. And their small house on the eastern edge of the ranch property was Abel's gift to them both, the gift of a man who had once been building something alone and understood what it meant to have a foundation. Ruth Kinney came to the Hayes Ranch for Christmas of 1886 and stayed for 3 days, which was longer than she usually stayed anywhere. And she sat at the long table with Abel and Francis and Thomas, and Miriam and Percival and Cobb and Harriet and Hector and his wife. And she ate good food and heard children's voices fill the rooms, and said, when Francis walked her out to the wagon on the morning she left, that she was very happy. Francis hugged her with her full arms and held on for a moment. Ruth patted her back in the brisk, capable way she had and said not to make a production of it. Frances said she was not making a production of anything, she simply loved her. Ruth said she knew that perfectly well and got into the wagon. In the early spring of 1888, Frances discovered she was expecting a third child, which she told Abel on another April morning in the garden. The garden had grown considerably since the first planting, and there were roses now along the fence line and lavender in the south corner, and the kitchen herbs that had started it all were thick and thriving and smelled of everything good. He held her face in his hands when she told him, which was what he did when he was feeling something too large for other expression, and she covered his hands with hers, and they stood in the garden in the April morning, in the way they had stood in it 10 years before on a different April morning, when everything they were to each other was still just beginning. Their third child, born in October of 1888, was a boy they named James for no particular ancestor, but because the name was solid and good, and when they said it, it sounded right, which was the only criterion either of them applied. James Hayes arrived in the world with his father's dark hair and his sister's focused expression, and very quickly demonstrated that he had firm opinions about most things, which Thomas said made sense because so did everyone else in the family. By 1890, the Hayes Ranch was a working, prosperous, growing thing, not wealthy in the way that the large cattle operations to the south were wealthy, but thoroughly established, self-sufficient, the kind of place that does what it sets out to do and does it well. Abel had built it from 140 acres and 32 cattle and one hired hand, and a great deal of determination, and it was his in the particular way of things that have been made rather than inherited, not with the complacence of possession, but with the ongoing pleasure of creation. And Frances had her school and her children and her garden and her house and her husband and Ruth Kinney's standing Sunday visits, and the knowledge accumulated over 12 years in this territory, laid down layer by layer like the good rich soil of the Kansas bottomland, that the brand they had put on her in Wichita, the brand that every man in every county between Abilene and Caldwell had looked at and found credible, was as false as the day it had been made. She had known that all along, of course. She had always known it. But knowing a thing alone, in the silence of your own certainty, when the world around you insists otherwise, takes a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself but simply endures. And then someone had come along who looked at the brand and said it was wrong, who said it plainly and privately and publicly and consistently, who said it not as performance but as plain fact, and the difference between carrying the truth alone and having it witnessed by someone else was the difference between survival and living. That was what Abel Hayes had given her in the end. Not rescue, she had not needed rescuing. Not rehabilitation, she had not needed that either. Simply the clear-eyed, unhesitating, uncomplicated recognition that she was exactly who she was, no more and no less, and that who she was worth knowing and worth loving and worth the work of a life built alongside her. She thought about this sometimes in the evenings on the porch at the ranch now, larger than Ruth's but occupied in the same spirit, when the children were inside, and the night was coming in over the flat grass, and Abel was beside her with his coffee. She thought about the carpetbag and the bonnet and the cold stairs on Main Street, and then she thought about this, about the solid wood of the porch under her feet, and the smell of the garden, and the sound of Thomas and Miriam and James moving around inside the house, and the man beside her, whose shoulder was warm under her head when she leaned against it. One evening in the summer of 1890, she told him all of this, told him what she had been thinking about, the full arc of it from the morning she had arrived in Caldwell to the evening they were sitting in. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting, which was entirely characteristic of him. When she was finished, he said, "You would have been all right regardless, you know that." She said she liked to think so. He said, "I know so. I have watched you for 12 years and I know exactly how much you are capable of, and it is considerable." She said, "You make it easier." He said, "You make everything easier. You make this land easier and this work easier and this life better than I had any reason to expect it could be." She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him in the summer dark. This man who had sat on a stone wall with 2 cups of coffee and talked to her like she was a person when she needed it most. This man who had called a false brand false and meant it without performance or agenda. This man who had built something real and invited her into it, and shared it with the wholehearted openness of someone who understood that the best things in life grow larger when they are shared. She said, "Abel Hayes, I think you are the love of my life." He looked at her with that expression she had first seen in June of 1878, and which she had been seeing every day for 12 years and which still moved her in the deep and irreducible way of things that are entirely true. He said, "Francis Hayes, you are the love of mine." The Kansas night was very large and very still around them, and the stars were out in the way they are in flat country with no lights to compete, which is more stars than most people in most places ever see, a full, extravagant, unguarded abundance of them, the whole sky given over to it. And the house behind them was warm and full of their children and their life, and they sat together on the porch in the full certainty of everything they had built, and it was good, and it was real, and it was entirely, sufficiently, completely theirs.